President Peres, if I could begin by saying Céad Míle Fáilte and Shalom. And if I could ask, certain critics have suggested that Israel perhaps has too fatalistic a view of its existence, and I appreciate modern Israel has not been around for terribly long, but how would you answer that suggestion?
Israel exists 62 years. In those 62 years, we were 7 times attacked. We never asked any other country to fight instead of ourselves. So we were outmanned and outgunned. Furthermore, there was a United Nations resolution about creating a two-state situation. It was called a Jewish state and an Arab state. The piece of land we got was a tiny piece of land that has had more frontiers than grounds. We couldn't exist there. But when we decided that is the decision of the United Nations, we accepted. The Arabs refused. And before we were able to build a nation or a country or an army, we were attacked. We were 650,000 people against 40 million. We didn't have rifles, we didn't have submachine guns, very little, very few, several hundreds. On top of it, the nations that voted for this resolution refused to give Israel rifles to defend their lives. Why? When the Russians sent time and again, and by the way, all the people who are now criticizing us, then they didn't say a word. They send planes and they send tanks. So, gentlemen, America is a great country, and Ireland is a wonderful country. I don't know what is your permission to make mistakes. We don't have a permission to make a mistake. If we shall lose once, we should be annihilated.
President Peres, certain sections of the media have been very critical of alleged extra parliamentary activities by agencies allegedly linked to Israel. How would you respond to that? Would you suggest that that some of that criticism is based on a failure to appreciate the fine balance between security and liberty? And even if that is appreciated and understood, do you believe that Israel is perhaps being singled out unfairly in that criticism?
Wars are not a pleasant occasion, and I'm not an advocate of wars. I don't want to justify wars. I want to justify only the right to defend our lives. And let me go even further, because the answer they legitimize us, I want to ask about their legitimacy. Once that a lawful country has to face an unlawful organization, you're in trouble. Take Europe. Europe attacked Kosovo. You killed 600 innocent people. You destroyed the Chinese embassy. I never saw that everybody suggested an investigation. There were events in Chechnya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Somalia, in Darfur. Nobody ever dared to suggest an investigation. Why was Israel picked up? We weren't the first to do so. And
why do you think Israel was picked up?
I know exactly, because we are a member of the United Nations that has a built-in majority against it, for different reasons. I cannot explain why there is anti-Semitism, why the Jews have tanks or bombs that endangered anybody. All the places they were, including Mr. Bloom, they were positive people. Why the hatred? Tell me. And why should I explain it? I think it's a non-Jewish sickness. I think it's a shame. And I don't feel any need to explain shames and mistakes. But for us, it's not a theory. Would it be anti-Semitism? Okay, we could explain it. Nobody paid a greater price for prejudices, for unfairness, for racism than our people.
If one checks out the Irish media, one is led to believe that the case against Israel is compelling. Is that something that makes you feel uncomfortable?
What I can say about the Irish, that I feel an affinity to them, because they have great poets, and great authors, because they're small and alone and they're capable and they're in a fighting spirit. And I can understand it. But to pass a judgment, it's not for me.
Mr. President, how would you rate the relationship diplomatically and economically between Israel and Ireland? And what is your own personal view on the attitude adopted by the Irish administration in relation to the difficulties between Israel and the Palestinians?
Okay, look, let me go a little bit to history then. We were attacked 7 times. Would we lose one time? We wouldn't sit here. You must understand it. Then we won the wars, and as a result, we won the land and the water. Once the country, a country that agreed to make with us peace, we gave back everything without the slightest change. We gave everything back to Egypt, everything back to Jordan. It was suggested that the Syrians will go with the Egyptians. Would they go? It would be the same thing. Now we came with the problem of the Palestinians. Now let me also be fair and open. There are 23 countries in the Middle East. 2 are non-Muslims. One was Lebanon, Christian, the other was Israel. The 2 were under constant attempt to be destroyed. Lebanon lost her character. She's no longer a Christian country. We are defending our lives. Now, the problem with the Palestinians is a difference. There was never a Palestinian state in history. There were never Palestinian borders. That is the difference. The West Bank was under the Jordanian spell. They never gave it to the Palestinians. Gaza was under Egyptian control. They never gave it to the Palestinians. The ones who said we are ready to recognize a Palestinian personality and a Palestinian state and Palestinian borders is Israel. And the gap is not so wide. The land is very small. For us, there is no difference or superiority because you're a Palestinian or you're a Jew or you're black and white. It doesn't exist.
So you would consider that the Israeli administration has a good working relationship with the Irish administration, or is their attitude towards the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians precluding them perhaps from doing a greater degree of business with Israel?
We want peace, whether it's business or not business. Peace is a value. It's not a matter of a price. We don't want to govern any other nation. It's a matter of principle, because it stands against anything we stand against. We don't accept it. They are superior and inferior. We do believe that every person was created in the image of the Lord. Unfortunately, we are all the time victimized because of it. And now I want to tell you one thing that is different between Ireland and us. I followed very much your people and your effort and your wars and your victims and the killings. And I sure not all the Irelands were so happy with the killing of innocent people in Ireland itself. The whole story here of the holiness is a little bit misunderstood. The Holy Basin, as we call it, or the ancient Jerusalem, or the Holy Jerusalem, is all told 1 square kilometer. That's it. That includes the holy city, Temple Mount. And this 1 square kilometer gave inspiration to the monotheistic religions, to almost half of the world population, and also was the source of conflicts for 2,000 years. The conflicts are among the religions and within the religions. You know, there is almost a war about who will hold a key to a door there. It's very complicated, very complicated. Now, I'm telling you that we are not going to control the holy places of the Muslims, and they won't control the holy places of the Jews. And the Muslims and the Jews will not control the holy places of the Christians. It will be open. when it was under non-Israeli control, we didn't have the right to visit the Wailing Wall. Why? Today everything is open. Go to Jerusalem every time. You'll hear the voice of the muazzin of the Muslims calling for a prayer. You'll hear the Jewish cantor calling for prayer. You'll hear the Christian priest calling for prayer. Nobody intervenes. Nobody says a word. So, I mean, that is a unique situation. It has its great advantages. It carries its great problems. And I think most of the debate is based on ignorance. As an American judge said, Judge Frankfurter, there are some gaps in the ignorances of all of us. So that is my answer.
Mr. President, if I could put to you the issue of settlements, and particularly the issue of settlements in East Jerusalem. The PA have suggested that this is an indication of bad faith and therefore a valid reason to discontinue negotiations. The Americans have been critical of settlement expansion. The Europeans in turn have been critical of settlement expansion. How would you respond to the issue of really from an Israeli perspective?
Again, I have to go to details to answer the question. There are 20 odd suburbs where the inhabitants are Arabs and 20 odd Jewish. We build in the settlements, in the suburbs, the Jewish live for the last 42 years. The United States didn't like it, others didn't like it, but they tolerated it. Not about they have their own map, we have our map. In the same 42 years, we did not build. In the Arab suburbs, they build. And I would suggest that we are quality, not a negative or positive. Let the Arabs build at their suburbs. Let us build in our suburbs. What they demand is not the building, but the change of a map. The change of a map can be done only through negotiations. Suppose our Prime Minister will decide to change now the map. He won't have the permission of the Parliament. So let's practice during the time of negotiations, as it was for 42 years, and we negotiated, all of us, by changing.
If you compare the situation now with the various times that you were involved in the peace negotiations, and obviously, as you know, what you always need on both sides is a preparation on the part of the people to accept painful and difficult compromises. After all that has happened here over the last few years, and the failure of various peace efforts in the past, how difficult is it going to be to prepare the people of Israel, as opposed to leave the Palestinian side, the people in Israel, for the difficult compromises that are likely to be necessary?
If there be an agreed compromise, 5 minutes. That's my view.
Good.
I don't take historians and I take psychologists as my advisor. Not because I'm such a superior person, but I'm a person that reads news. If somebody would come to me in 1944, by the end of the Second World War, and say Europe that was torn to pieces, 1,000 years of wars and killing and terror, that in 3 years we shall see a different Europe, I would say, gentlemen, don't tell me stories. You see, you have to educate and re-educate generations. In 3 or 2 years, the whole continent of 1,000 years of hatred and war and bloodshed was changed. So my teacher is Ben-Gurion. He says all experts are experts for what has happened. You don't have an expert for what may happen. So here I'm not looking for expert. I'm looking for the right way to do. How long will it take it? In my judgment, if there be an agreement, in spite whatever is saying on both sides, you'll be surprised. But the difficulty is that I'll tell you what was advanced, what remains, to answer your question. What was advanced, as far as I'm concerned, is the end of the principal debate in Israel between the ones like myself who were for a two-state solution, living side by side. Today it became the view of the majority of the state of Israel. For me, it's an achievement. I mean, the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu, that was the head of the Likud, agreed to two-state solution brings an end to this debate, number one. Number two, the fact that we are enabling and the Palestinians are starting to build a state instead of debating a state is the right. Amen. I want to tell you, when the partition was decided and the Arabs attacked us, when we decided to do something which is most unusual, to build a state without borders. There was no marks of borders in our constitution or in the Declaration of Independence. Said we shall build and then we shall see. Would Arabs do the same? The builders would finally meet, we know where more or less, and then would mark the line. But the Palestinians prefer to debate the borders instead of building a state. Now they are beginning to build a state. To have a state is not just to issue declarations or afford opportunities. It is to plant a tree, to build a house, to build institutions, to answer the poor and the old and the young. It's a husbandry. So the second thing which makes me hopeful is the fact that the Palestinians started to build. And we are following suit. We dismantle, today they announced another dismantling of checkpoints. And furthermore, don't make a mistake. The better the Palestinians will have it, the better neighbors we shall have. We are not interested to see an inferior state in a poor state. Nonsense. We understand perfectly well that in order to have full peace, we must have equality too. And we don't close our eyes. So don't take us as a simplistic group of people. We paid a heavy price for it.
Could I ask you, go back to Ben Gurion, 1947. He
Yes.
made an agreement with, was it Agudat Israel?
With whom?
Agudat,
Yes.
yeah. My understanding was Ben Gurion always was favourite of a secular state or a democratic state. And my thinking is that that agreement perhaps has dictated what has come out over the last 62 years. That maybe in retrospect would you have endorsed that agreement?
Well, I negotiated agreement, young and Ben Gurion in power. Let me first of all tell you what was the agreement.
Okay.
They came and they say, look, under all regimes all over the world, we have had yeshivas. You know what yeshiva is?
Yes.
The Tsars, they never closed it. Here in Israel, you won't permit us to have a yeshiva. And I asked for numbers. They say, we want that those boys who don't work, but only are studying, will be excused, exempt from military service. Let me tell you something which is personal. The man that negotiated resembled very much my grandfather, who was a rabbi himself. I'm not ashamed of it. He was my mentor. He was my teacher, clearly. And when we departed, he was later burned by the Nazis. He says one thing, be true. No. He says, okay, you have a understandable background and center. But then I ask myself something else. If the Buddhists will come to me and say exempt 150 Buddhist monks because we want to continue our religion, I'm telling you without any doubt that I would do that. I like. Now it's different between state and church in Israel, because Judaism is not a church. It was never a church. And Judaism is either not just nationality, because we are consider ourselves as a people of the world, Am Olam. And Israel without moral foundation, and that tells you a pragmatic person, cannot exist. It's nonsense. We cannot convince our own children. If the purpose is just to have a piece of land or a drop of water, forget it. We went to a country that was a desert, poor, deserted, and not to be accused of colonialism, we decided to do two things: to cultivate the land with our own hands. We didn't use the Arabs as our workers, and to defend our land with our own boys. We didn't trust the Americans for defense. And that what led a young man like myself to go to a kibbutz. I could easily go and, make business like my father or something like that. No.
Sure.
So that is answering. What happened is that since we were under the British mandate and we were under the hostile relations of our neighbors, we have had to build a state based on agreement, not on the law, among the parties. So the first who wrote the draft of the state was a coalition of parties, and you have had to volunteer to it. And Ben-Gurion has had to work very hard, because the religious don't believe so much in a state at all. And he tried to hammer out a coalition that will keep the principles of Judaism, the principle of humanity, the principles of democracy. And it cost a price, like you have now in Great Britain. Mm-hmm. Napoleon once said he prefers to fight against a coalition than with a coalition. What is true about war is true about politics as well. So to answer your question, it wasn't an agreement between a religion and a state. It was a specific agreement about 150 boys to be exempt for military service to maintain the yeshiva in Israel.
Now, the reason why I asked that is because it always struck me that the secularists in Israel might have an easier time making peace with the secularists on the Palestinian side. It's the religious that seem to have problems with each other.
I wouldn't make a war against religion or secular. I think this is a personal decision, not a national decision. And I wouldn't go for organization of religious parties or secular parties, but political parties, where you have room both for secular and religious.
Sometimes when we hear statements coming out from cabinet ministers in Israel, we wonder internationally, how should they be interpreted? Should they be interpreted for how they play against world opinion? Or should we interpret them more for how they're intended for domestic consumption? I'm particularly thinking here of declarations either for or against peace with Palestinians, for or against this type of structure of states, or otherwise. How would you feel about that?
Look, I'm an old hand in politics, so permit me not to be enthusiastic about every declaration issued by a minister. I have this freedom. I wouldn't give it up. Okay. And not to be so much impressed by polls. I say polls is like perfume, nice to smell, dangerous to swallow. Furthermore, I want to tell you that every person has two opinions. I don't know when he uses when it comes to poll. I don't believe there is anybody in the world that supports anything 100%. In most cases, you're 49 for, 51 against, and you can't change it overnight. Mm-hmm. So I think, look, that I learned from you. You have to decide what is good for people and not what you think people think it's good. And it needs courage. Because people like peace, they don't like the price of peace. Nobody likes it. So you have to take a risk and pay the cost. I lost elections because many people thought that I went too long. I wouldn't change my mind because I don't think that winning election is the only purpose in life. In history, we dismantled walls more then we build bridges. So I don't see a wall, more than a wailing wall. A wall of necessity is option. The wall did one thing. It stops terrorists, the car bombs, and suicidal terrorists to come to Israel. Since the wall, we don't have it anymore. Look, I was Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. I know what it means. When after we have the Oslo II agreement, and after my colleague Rabin was assassinated, and I said, I'm going to continue in spite of everything. And we handed over to the Palestinians 430 villages to their control, 6 cities. They wanted to have a vote in Jerusalem, and I made an arrangement so they can vote even in Jerusalem. Not in their Jerusalem, in Jerusalem. And then imagine, and you can imagine I was highly criticized. Now I want to give you a plastic description of what I'm talking about. I usually go to my office at 7 o'clock. I came in the car. My bodyguards told me that just now there was an explosion of a bus in the heart of Jerusalem, and 40 people were killed. I told them, go there, instead of the office. We came in 15, 20 minutes later. The whole square was covered with blood and parts of bodies. There were 1,000 people around, and ambulances and policemen. The minute I arrived, I was quiet, and then all of them started to shout, "Murderer! Look what he did to us." What could I answer? Okay. The next day, the same happened in Tel Aviv. I went to Tel Aviv, another bus was exploded. Again, tens of people were killed. The street was red, bodies around. I came in, quiet a moment, again murderer. The second, the third day in Ashkelon. I knew I lost, because people would criticize me for the concessions I made, but they wouldn't forgive me for that. I spoke with Arthur, asked him, what are you doing? I knew exactly who is the man who did it. Ask him, he's under your control. Get hold of him. Let him stop doing it. He says, no, I checked, he's not here. So I asked the chief of our intelligence to go and see the chief of his intelligence and tell him the whereabouts. He didn't lift a finger. I know that when I lost the elections, Arafat was crying. But what could I do with the tears? Only later, when he understood what happened, he took some measures. And happily enough, my successor enjoyed the cut of it. The wall undoubtedly saved lives of innocent people. The minute there won't be a need for it, it won't happen. The model I'm thinking about, the best model is the relations between us and Jordan. The Jordanians and us fight terror. We don't have maybe a common enemy, but we have a common interest. The world today is made more of dangers than of enemies. Enemies have a uniform in the center and the law and the command. 10, 20 people cannot get organized. And so the border between us and the Jordanians is the longest, because it goes like a snake. There are no single Israeli soldier in Jordan. There was no single Jordanian soldier here, and it's quiet. We suggested the Palestinians to do likewise. By the way, who contributed to Jordan to become a state was an Englishman, Glab Pesha, helped them to train a force and defend the land. The Palestinians, instead of having one army, have 3 or 4 armies. You can make a coalition between political parties, but not between armed political parties, as you know in Ireland. The problem in Ireland is not that you had 2 different parties, but they carry arms, and they used to fire. What I'm saying, we are doing, the quartet is helping the Palestinians with our accord to build a defense force of their own. An American general is doing actually what Glab Pesha did in Jordan, training them. The minute they'll be prepared, we shall hand it over to them. There is one city that is prepared to handle security in the name of Jenin, we hand it over to them. Now, let me say, all these stories are so unfair to us. We did the World War for separation. What sort of a nonsense is it? How else could we defend our lives? And what is the rights of other people to criticize it when they cannot stop it and they cannot defend us? You must also be fair, that the attitude that somebody is judge and the other is a culprit is not unacceptable. I know day in, day out what happened to my country. And believe me, I look upon an Arab as a human being like myself, as a man with the same qualities. But they have what we don't have. They have 22 countries. They expelled 1 million people from their countries, Jewish people who came here. But again, I don't want to make out of it arithmetic or financial calculation. That's not the point. So that's my answer.
But how contentious is the issue of Jerusalem? The Palestinian Authority, for instance, have said that Jerusalem, as the capital of a future independent Palestinian state, is non-negotiable. So I wonder if I could ask you, what's the Israeli attitude towards that stance by the Palestinian Authority? Would Israel be prepared to accept East Jerusalem as the capital of an independent Palestinian state at some future negotiated date?
They put it on the table, wanted to negotiate it, and I think, and that was, by the way, the suggestion of President Clinton, that was accepted by the Israeli side. I can't speak now on behalf of the government, I don't want to, but I can mention facts. 2 prime ministers accepted it in the past. Clinton said in simple terms, the Jewish quarters to the Jewish quarters, and the Palestinian quarters to the Palestinian people. That's it. I mean, the problem is not when the sun rises. The problem is where the people live, because it rises for all of us the same way.
But what about the settlements on the West Bank? As they expand, whether it is through natural process or whether it's through opportunism, do they not become a barrier to a sustainable peace? And you seem to be suggesting that as a solution emerges, it will automatically be accepted. Is that a misinterpretation of what you're saying?
There was a solution suggested and accepted by the Palestinians and us. I'm not talking about the present government, because the present government talked for itself. The idea was to have 3 locations for the existing settlers on the land of the West Bank, and have a swap of land. The difference was that our former Prime Minister asked for 5.9% of his swap, and the Palestinians agreed to 1.9%. Now they published informally that they're ready to 4%. So what are we talking about? The problem is not about the number of the people, but about the distribution of the land. We cannot return to the 67 borders, but the Palestinians agree not to speak about the 67 borders, but the 67 space. And the space, in order to be fair, you can equalize it by swap.
The official Israeli government policy is to work for a 2-state solution. So I wonder, could I ask, how urgent is it that a 2-state solution is implemented?
Very urgent. We disagree with the legitimacy, because we think that what you do answer not you personally, excuse me, the answer that legitimize us are legitimizing terror, killing, murder, hanging people because they're homosexuals, incitement, bluffs. What is the alternative? And that is that the Jews have had to fight so hard for their existence, and Israel so hard for her. Is it our invitation? Is it our choice? We asked for it. It made us happy.
Could I move along, Mr. President, and ask about Iran? There was a statement attributed to yourself, and I don't know if you could confirm or deny it, when Ahmadinejad said Israel should be wiped off the map, and it was claimed that you said he should remember that Iran could be wiped off the map. Was that said?
No, sir.
Okay.
I never threatened any other. I said that he is acting against the Charter of the United Nations. Because according to this charter, a member of the United Nations doesn't have the right to threaten another member.
Sure.
And I asked the Secretary General of the United Nations, why don't you stand up against it? It's not a matter of majority. The United Nations is an organization, when it comes to us, we don't stand a chance. There's a block made of the Arab League, of the Muslim League. We can never be right. But keep your charter. And what I suggested about Iran time and again, in my eyes, even prior to economic sanctions, are moral sanctions. I think moral corruption is the worst corruption in the world. And he's behaving like he would be another prophet. My God.
You can't build a wall against them, though.
Pardon?
You can't build a wall against them the way there can be a wall.
You can build a set of values. A moral wall is stronger in my eyes than a wall made of blocks. I mean, what I would like to see is that people will be ashamed to support the Ayatollahs and their policies.
So are they a problem with their nuclear policy? Are they inevitable? Is it the interest?
There are two things. There is the system and there is the bomb.
Okay.
Bombs don't fire themselves.
Of course.
So we have to see that the bombs will be, if they have to be, in responsible hand. And the Iranians themselves are uncomfortable with the government, many of them.
Of course. Yeah.
Instead of taking a strong moral position against this system, which is the center of terror of our time, which threatens to destroy another country, that denies the Holocaust, that makes a laugh of all of us. To say Israel is wrong, my God, what do you want from Israel?
So what about Hezbollah then? Are they acting in their own right, or are they an agent of Iran?
Hezbollah is an agent of Iran, as Hamas is. Hezbollah destroyed Lebanon in the meantime, and Hamas prevents the Palestinians from having a state under the guidance and finance of Iran.